There you go. All right. Some technical difficulties to get started with this podcast, but we are here. This is Marco Ciappelli. The podcast today, this episode is on audio signals, which is where we talk about stories, storytellers, and storytelling in general. And that, as you know, if you heard me before, it could be anything. Photographer, painter, writer, musician, even going to the grocery store and communicating with someone, you're still telling a story. So pretty much, for me, everybody is a storyteller, and we're all made of stories. Some stories are more interesting than other, but I think it's subjective. I love ghosts. So today, we're actually going to talk about that. But it's not those ghosts with the sheets. And that I always make a joke with my wife. I want to dress just like that for Halloween, just a sheet on and make some hole for eyes at kind of Charlie Brown. But these are ghosts that somebody have seen, let's say, or imagine to see them. We'll figure it out into an hospital, if I understand well. And because our guest, Gary Simonds, is actually a retired neurosurgeon and still teaching, but he's going to tell us about that. So, Gary, welcome to the show. I said I was going to do it a little short, but then I get carried away, and I gave you a push here. But tell us more about yourself and what you do nowadays.
Oh, sure. Well, first of all, thank you so very much for having me. It's an honor. And I've looked forward to this conversation. I for most of my my adult life, I've been involved in medicine, and as you said, practiced neurosurgery for many years. Did thousands and thousands and thousands of operations. Headed a neurosurgical program and residency training program, and did all that sort of stuff. But I put the scalpel down a few years ago for a number of reasons. And since that time, as you noted, I've been teaching med students, undergrads, but really focused more, one, on my wife, who I kind of neglected for 40 some years, and two, on writing. And I've been writing books.
Well, that's pretty good. So I mentioned ghosts, and I want to get right there. How a neurosurgeon that you expect maybe will write something a little bit more related to what you do, you decided to go into some kind of paranormal or normal, whatever. I don't know what angle you have there. I'm very curious. And tell me a little bit about that. Tell me about the book that you wrote.
Well, I had written a few books before, all nonfiction, and through much of my life, you talk about stories. Well, every patient that you interface with, every patient you see, every family you take care of, I mean, it's just nothing but stories. And some are pretty darn harsh. Some are very heartwarming. But boy, these are very intense stories at very intense moments in everybody's lives, probably the most intense moments in their lives. And I always kind of would write down little vignettes or think about little vignettes. And I wanted at some point just to bring it to the public, just to kind of understand more what's going on behind the veils, if you will, of modern day neurosurgery and modern medicine in general, and hopefully to get a real sense of the humanity of all involved, particularly the patients and their families and their bravery. And originally it was going to be a nonfiction book, again, me just talking about it. And I started writing it, and I said, God, this is boring. I'm not sure if people would really enjoy this or not. And I started thinking, well, what if I made this a novel instead, and kind of put people right into the middle of the fray rather than being outside observers. So I wanted to make it a book about the neurosurgical world, but a novel. And, after a while thinking about it, I thought, well, geez, most of my professional time I spent very much right on the dividing line of life and death with so many people. And I began thinking about, that transition from life to death, and us always trying to pull people back from it, if you would. But were there another world besides ours, if there is more to it all than just what we experience? I could see somehow people like what I was doing right there at the interface between the two worlds, maybe having some of one world spill into the other periodically for them. And that's where the idea started generating. And I thought of the concept of, well, what if we have a neurosurgeon who's clearly beat up, clearly burning out, who begins to see ghosts? And, originally he's of course going to be scientific and believe that maybe it's seizures, maybe it's sleep deprivation, but it's never going to be something from another dimension. But as the story goes on, he convinces himself, for a number of reasons, that these are really ghosts, and they're terrifying to a certain degree. But he's trying to figure out what in the world they would want with him, and trying to figure out if they're trying to message him, get to him, or maybe even pull him over to their side of the bridge, if you will, between life and death. So hopefully it becomes a thriller for people. But, throughout it all, we see his life in neurosurgery, hears and sees all these stories of his various patients who come to him because of traumas and strokes and tumors and that sort of thing. And so hopefully I really wanted it to be very immersive for the reader, with this paranormal twist.
It's very cool. So so the first thing that comes to mind is that lately I am interviewing a lot of writers that become writers after, or while they're still in their career, but when they have experience, like I mentioned, like former pilots and military that become lawyers, and then they end up writing a book just about that. And there is a line in between where you stop being all reality driven and scientific, if I may, and you throw the fiction in it, and that could be again in a psychological thriller. It can be into one of the last interview was with AI that become part of a team of people that need to resolve something, but they don't just use AI, but actually AI become integral part of the team. And this come from the background of science. So I'm going to ask you the same thing. Like, where do you stop and say, this is the part where I'm allowed to really go fictional? And I guess talking about ghosts, it's kind of like, you're already going there, but is there a strong connection with the reality of and factual things? Right.
Absolutely. At least in this case, I have some other books that are probably going to drift a little further, but I wanted the neurosurgery side of it and the patient experience side of it and the stories behind the patient's injuries and illnesses and the reactions of the family to be all very real. So I definitely used experiences that I had and stories that I had encountered, and of course changed them so that they wouldn't be identifiable or anything like that. But this is the real stuff. And I always worked in these big trauma centers with helicopters coming in every few minutes and a lot of injured people and people with strokes and stuff like that, a lot of an emergent neurosurgical side of things. It was busy. It was just busy, particularly in the middle of the night, which is when really bad things seem to happen. Anyway, quite a few people have challenged me and said, "Oh, you must have made up, the intensity of this and the volume of it. The fact that you would, the neurosurgeon would be up every few nights, all night long." And I said, "No, I can tell you, none of this is hyperbolic. If anything, I tried to tone down some of it just because I didn't want it overwhelming." So yeah, that side is very real. The science is very real. And the reader has to decide how real the ghosts and the paranormal side of it is.
And are the stories inspired by some real fact? Like, were you thinking about some situation that you lived with, experiencing with some patients, and they ended up, of course, not named, but in the book itself?
Yeah, I tried not to make it 1-to-1. So I would, everything would be kind of an amalgam of patient stories, doctors, that sort of thing, rather than be a direct reporter. But that is, but again, it's very real. And I definitely wanted people to experience the reality of it, as opposed to, again, getting too hyperbolic and making it too heroic or something like that. So I wanted it to be as true to form as possible. Even with the ghosts, one of the things I tend to ask readers is, ultimately, what do you think was more frightening, the paranormal side of this, or the very normal, very real side of modern day medicine and hospital function and that sort of thing?
Yeah, that's pretty cool. Pretty cool and pretty harsh at the same time, I guess.
It is harsh. It's not I don't think it's an easy read, to be honest.
Okay. So let's move a little bit into the other thing that you mentioned when you suggested to be on the show, which is the fact that you're still teaching, and the fact that, like I said at the beginning, we're all made of stories. We use storytelling. It's what we use for since the existing of time of our society, to pass knowledge, to communicate to each other, stay in society, and make things work. And some are better than other at doing so. But it's definitely something that it's very, very much what makes us human, I think. So using stories when you, for example, teach, and when you even interact with situations that are, as you mentioned, may not be pleasant, when you're dealing with relatives, when you're dealing with, I think that throwing that metaphor, that something that it brings an example, that it became easier to digest, maybe easy to understand. How do you apply this into your other life that is not the writer's life?
Yeah, Marco, I agree with you. I think it is both a critical and important way to convey concepts, but also far more interesting for people. And so, for example, I have a course at Virginia Tech that we call Exploring Clinical Neuroscience, and it's for undergrads, usually interested in medicine. But we basically look at various neurological diseases and how they're treated. And where I like to go from there, frankly, is springboard off of the disease into kind of medical socioeconomics and ethics and that sort of thing. But we always start with a patient history, a patient story, very much kind of get into the patient's story, the patient's situation. And you can see the students pulled into it, by humanizing it, rather than just throw up an X-ray and say, here, we have to deal with this. You talk about the person, you talk about how it presented, you talk about how they spoke with you, and how they reacted to their diagnosis. And it very much pulls them in, and then they, you can see them want to help this patient as we go through the class, which I think is, it's really just a delight to do, and you can just see the excitement fill them. And I think it's because we start with the stories first, and we can deal with the science later, and then we kind of go back to the stories again and get into the surrounding concepts and issues beyond the pure science.
I think that. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, and for example, also when I was training neurosurgical residents, these are people who've gone through medical school and learning neurosurgery, we would use stories there a lot as well. I mean, every day you were presenting stories anyway, but in our academic sessions, we would often go into role playing, for example, just to give them an experience. And we had a bunch of physician assistants, or what we call PAs, who would do great jobs portraying patients in various states of distress, and I think, again, just entering into the story very much helped with the learning.
It's interesting you're going there. I'm actually, I read what a lot of people may think not fun stuff, although I like to read a lot of sci-fi as well, and even Harry Potter. But right now I'm actually finishing a book called The Battle for Your Brain, and it's about neurotechnology. And it's from an ethical perspective, is all the CGI and all the scanning done, even to see like how you meditate if you do it successfully, but also like Thought Police coming 1984, George Orwell. So I love your opinion on this as a neurosurgeon, and if you deal with situation like this when you actually get into, I don't know, I'm not a doctor myself, but when you go into the recovery phase, changes in the brain activity. I mean, this whole book goes from the ethics to the actual description of how memory works, or how we perceive the world. So I'm taking this opportunity to get your opinion on where are we going with this, because it seems like we can literally read people's mind.
Yeah, I think, obviously I find the subject super fascinating. There's a few things to say. I think one of the most fascinating things about the brain is that I think a lot of people still see it almost like a computer. You put it together in the factory, you have these connections and that connections. You can load a bunch of software into it, but basically the wiring is set. You have a wiring diagram, and that's how it's set, and that's how it's going to function from this day on. If you need a more complicated or a more complex system, you're going to have to buy one later on. You're going to have to switch out.
You can upgrade.
But what's really fascinating, I think, about our brains is that we're not hardwired. Our wiring is changing minute to minute, second to second, with all the experiences that we're going through. So it's always changing, and I think partially that is one of the reasons why we may be able to tap into it so well, is that it adapts. And so, if we set up a brain electronic interface, it's possible for our brain to adapt to that interface and actually start interacting with computers through it. And so it really leaves the door open to some wild and crazy stuff. And I saw a fair amount of this in its early stages because I started in the military medicine, and I was out by the time there were all the horrible injuries from the Second Gulf War. But a lot of my friends were still in it, and they were doing a fair amount of research in that brain electronic interface and seeing if we could move robotic arms and that sort of thing, which we can. And we all know the technology is going to continue to explode. So all these electronic interfaces with the brain going one direction or the other, the brain controlling something external or the external world reading the brain, is very much coming. And obviously it has frightening potential ramifications, as well as amazing, miraculous support of human beings and human disease and that sort of thing. But boy, you could really see it go dark. Imagine it go dark pretty easily.
Yeah, I can see you write a book about this. It makes you think. And of course, any conversation related to technology, there is always, it's about how you use it. And it's a tool, and you can use it for good and for bad, and go from there. Let's go back into the storytelling part and actually the education, because I'm pretty passionate about that. I'm a big fan of, again, telling stories to inspire also people, maybe kids that learn the moral and the virtues, and back in the days could have been a not so kids friendly, the way that in the way that Disney maybe adapted into a more mild way to present it. But the Grimm's brothers, they were pretty harsh. But I grew up reading that stuff myself. Pinocchio, the book Pinocchio, it's actually not the Pinocchio you see in the Disney. It's pretty heavy. So my point is, again, we learn from stories. And if there is one person that I think it made a big difference in my generation as a kid, Carl Sagan, that started telling this amazing story and educate people on subject like space exploration and physics and all of that were not very digestible. So there is that level where those that have the knowledge, they want to keep it for themselves. And those that said, no, we need to share this knowledge. And I think to do that, there's nothing better than storytelling. So either your perspective on this, and also how you actually use it when you're in the class. I mean, what kind of story do you tell?
Yeah, there's obviously a lot of science books out there, and I've because of my work and probably just interest, you end up reading tons of science over the years. Some science writers, though, are really good at injecting story even into a purely nonfiction work. And so I can think of several where they'll be talking about some scientific progress and research over time. And sometimes they'll just throw in some vignettes about the scientists themselves. And, they got into this accident, hurt their arm. For that reason, they got interested in how the muscles of the fingers work and blah, 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 blah. But they start, with some sort of vignette about the scientists themselves. And again, it pulls you in rather than just reading on and on and on of the pure science. So I agree. Any way that you can weave a story in is very worthwhile. Through the years, I've given a lot of talks on a lot of different subjects, medicine related, and I always try to pull in a story. So, like one example is throughout I worked in trauma centers, and throughout the years, I noticed that when a trauma would come in, a bad trauma from a terrible car accident or something like that, we would get called down for the neurological concerns, and we'd walk in and we'd say, what's going on? And there'd be 20 people around the patient, and the lead person would turn to us and say, well, this is Mr. Jones. He's a 32-year-old who's went through his windshield and, went down the pavement for 50 yards and has pneumothorax and ruptured spleen and broken femur. And, they go through a laundry list of terrible injuries. And, just hearing this, if you're an outside person, I think first thing you would be thinking is, oh my God, how does anybody survive this? And that poor son of a gun. But it was funny in a weird way. It was so common at the end of this list of terrible injuries that often they would say something like, but he was drunk. And I heard it so many times it got the wheels turning, and I'm thinking, why do we say something like that? I've noticed that sort of response. But he was drunk, but he was taking drugs, but he was gotten in a fight, but he was in a bar at 3 a.m. And of course, this would happen. And I began to think that part of it is that, when we see all these horrible things as physicians, we probably start feeling vulnerable ourselves, or we start worrying about our own family members. And so if there's some mitigating circumstance that we can at least tell ourselves, yeah, but they were drunk, we wouldn't do that. Yeah, but they were shooting up, we wouldn't do that. Yeah, but they were at the bar at 3 a.m, we wouldn't do that. Anyway, I began thinking that I worried that we may devalue and make judgments on certain patients. And I wanted to address that and just bring that out for people to think about and talk about, because we don't want to do that. We want to treat every patient, as if they're the president of the United States. So what I did for this lecture, for this talk that I would give, I talked about the fact that back when I was in college, I lived in New Jersey, and we went to visit a friend of mine in a college just across the river in Pennsylvania. And he came down with 2 big bottles of wild turkey and said, "You guys better drink." And it turned out that his girlfriend of many years had broken up with him that night. So we were ordered to drink, and we obeyed, and we helped him drink these bottles of wild turkey. And then it was time to crash, to go to sleep. But we're looking around the basement of his fraternity. We said, we're not staying here. We decided to drive home. And each of us were kind of like, I don't know, I've had a bit to drink. There was about 5 or 6 of us in the car. And one of us said, "Hey, no, I'm fine. I didn't have that much. I can drive home safely." So we all get in the car. We drive back to New Jersey. We go to sleep in the living room of one of our friends. They lived on this farm. And in the morning, one of my friends looks out the window and goes, who drove us home last night? And I said, "Well, that would be me." And he said, "Come here." And he points out the window, and they had this long farm front lawn, if you will. And there were all these tire marks all the way across it, in zigzags. And we look to the right, and the car is parked in the bushes of the front of the house. And what I try, and so the way I go with that is to say, look, we all do stupid things. There for me, but for the grace of God, I could have been on the trauma stretcher, and everybody's saying, but he was drunk. And so again, I think it carries a real impact, particularly when you can relate it to yourself, and particularly if it's self-deprecating as opposed to how wonderful am I. But I've always found that, some self-deprecation and some humor in these stories goes a long way.
Absolutely. And I think it's a way you always want to justify that there is one reason, and you can pinpoint in an easy way. Yeah, it's black or white. It took drugs. That's why this person died. Like, if you read the news and there is a celebrity or somebody that dies, and it's in a young age, you kind of expect to say, like, yes, but, like,
exactly.
Oh, it took drugs, it did this, or it had a problem before, because you don't, that's not going to be me. And I think it's very human too.
Of course.
Like psychology there. But dealing with this situation, my question for you on this is, when you're facing this situation, by you I mean anybody that then is going to be the one doing a surgery, whatever kind of surgery, not just, neuro or like bones or whatever it is. Does it change your attitude? I mean, ethically shouldn't, obviously, and I think it doesn't, but doesn't it put that human something in the back of your head where, am I performing a lesser quality just because the guy is a delinquent, or the guy got shot by the cops because maybe he's a criminal. I mean, how do you teach that to the younger? I mean, you say role playing and all of that, but you got to go through that stuff.
Yeah, and again, I think that's where the storytelling is very important, and again, where we can reinforce the fact that that we all do things that we're not proud of, and I think it calls upon them, therefore, to think about it themselves. When have I done something where I could have easily been injured, and what do I do to myself that is not particularly smart in terms of long-term health, and think about all sorts of behaviors that we all engage in, or just take our mind off of driving for a second, and look down at our phone or whatever. I mean, it's countless, as you go through. We're all human. We all have foibles. We all make mistakes. So I think it's real important, as you say, particularly to get this through to our learners. But frankly, we need to remind ourselves all the time too. We had another exercise that we found was particularly effective for our residents. Because, again, they're learning the tricks of the trade, and they got to go out and be able to do it. We have 7 years to train them, but there's a lot to learn. So one of the exercises that we would do is periodically we'd have one of the senior members of the faculty just talk about something within the medical world that they did that was a horrible mistake, or was terribly embarrassing, or they had a terrible complication with the patient, or they got into a terrible argument with the patient family, or they got sued. And our residents found that to be some of the most valuable time. Just these stories that, look, these people who you're kind of venerating and you're learning so much from, where you are too. They've made their share of errors. And the key that we would try to reinforce is you're going to make mistakes. You are absolutely going to make mistakes, and some are going to cause great harm. So you got to learn from them. You can't brush them off. You can't say it's the will of God. You can't blame it on the patient. You got to say, okay, can I do better next time? How can I do better next time?
And also know that, chances are that it's going to happen. And
it's going to happen.
You have to be prepared, because, as you say, we are human. Even, I don't know, even Formula One driver that are the most trained out there, or IndyCar, we're in the US, I'm European, so I think Formula One, they still make mistakes. And they have even the best technology nowadays, and telemetry and computers and all of that, but they're still going to touch the guardrail and flip around. So even the best. So I think telling story, preparing for the future, we go back to, as kids, there is no better way, in my opinion, to educate than through stories, and learning that that's how life eventually is going to be. But we can't predict everything. So, and we got to have some fun. So I love the fact that you actually throw all the fiction in there. And of course, I understand it's not a fun adventure of ghosts going through the walls of a city and making pranks, but it's interesting. So let's end up with this. I'd like to know, what's your next project? Are you going to keep writing? Are you writing something new nowadays? But also, when did you start writing? So give me the beginning and the end as we wrap this. So when did you start writing, and what are you going to do next?
Yeah, it's interesting, Marco. If you think about it, in my profession, you are writing all the time, number one. I mean, you are writing all the time. Every patient you see, you got to write up. It's just nonstop, all sorts of different reasons to write. But even there, when you see a patient, you just have a typical patient visit. you can it almost is a story that you write. You're writing a little bit about their background, their history. You're writing this hopefully so that next time you read your own note, you can tell what you were thinking, which is one of them. In fact, I'll give you a little vignette on that. We were so busy that for a while there, I hired a bunch of what we call scribes in medicine. Now it's very common to have scribes, particularly in the emergency room or anywhere where you're doing high volume. And the scribes would just write down everything that happens in your patient interview. And I did that for a few months, and I looked back and I stopped it. I was like, I can't tell what I was thinking, because it was almost like a voice dictation. But there was none of the, what's my thought process? What's the patient look like? How do they seem? All that sort of thing didn't get in there. Whereas when I was writing it myself, it almost became a narrative, around that patient. And then you got to the scientific facts. So I would not use voice activation or scribes anymore. I just wrote it out myself. And then you're always writing scientific articles. As I said, I wrote some medically related books. So I wrote all the time. And it wasn't until I started this that I started fiction, which I had no idea what I was doing. So I read a bunch of books on how to write fiction. I don't know if it helped or not. I don't proclaim to be an accomplished fiction writer, but I will tell you this, back to, the subject at hand. It is so much fun compared to writing nonfiction. Nonfiction for me feels like book reports always, and I'm always, getting frustrated and tired out from doing it. Writing fiction, I can sit down for 6 straight hours writing, and it just doesn't stop. It just comes pouring out. So to answer your question on what else is coming out, again, I'm a newbie in this. The people in the publishing world would tell you should stay within a genre and get people, used to you and interested in you and wanting to read more of the same stuff. And I'm not doing that. So the next book is a soccer book, which you might appreciate. Although it eventually ends up in the Premier League, but I was hoping to catch the interest of young men, particularly here in America, particularly with the World Cup coming around and stuff. So it's just a coming of age soccer book. And then I have a book that I'm kind of trying an experiment where I'm going to put the chapters out online as I write them and see what people think and see if they want to play with it or play with me, on what to do. But in that book, it does go back a little neuro. It's kind of a post-apocalyptic, where a disease strikes much of the world. It kills quite a few people, but for the survivors, it lowers their IQ. It makes them hyper religious and fearful and somewhat more violent. And so the world kind of deteriorates into a more autocratic or more fascist type of situation. And then it's just going to be the story of one person trying to escape with their family and survive.
I love that. Screw the rules. Don't listen to them. Hey, you write what you want to write.
Well, that's the fun, getting back into storytelling is once you're in fiction, you can do whatever you want. I mean, things can happen whatever way you want them to happen. So, it really is a blast.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I mean, I've spent all my life writing, copy in advertising, branding, and I love it. I have fun, writing now articles about cybersecurity but first of all, now it's easier. I just talk about it, and then I have a transcript of the show, so that's easy. Thank you, ChatGPT. But I want to make a point about when you go back and write, it's a way to reflect on on certain things that when you just dictate, you can't. And an example for me is I have all these conversations, sometimes are about AI, they're heavy, they're about, social media, politics, and manipulations, information, and all of that, and all of these. And then even if I do, declare that I get help from generative AI to write the summary, I still kind of go through it, and I remember things that, oh yeah, we did talk about that. Oh yeah, and I learn. That's when I memorize our conversations more than when we are actually having that conversation. So the tone of voice, whatever you wrote, it's completely different. So that just to make a point that it's important to, I think writing is a way to self-reflect. And the other one is, just have fun. I mean, when you go into fiction, I'm writing some short stories with my mom, actually, that we translate in English, and they're for kids, and they're completely enchanted, magical, fictitious, and I love it because there is no rules. I can make the character do whatever I want, and it's so much fun. I don't need to justify it. It's magic.
It really is. It's a joy, and I'll tell you one other angle to it, which I didn't realize, and I found to be really exciting. And that is, and I've heard it, many times, particularly since, but they say that, once you release a story or a novel, it's no longer yours. So, you may have started with certain intentions, and this is what this was going to symbolize, or this is what I was trying to get across here. And once the readers start going through it, they put their own interpretations upon it, their own life experiences upon it, their own stories upon it. And it is so interesting to hear their versions. And half the time I'm going, oh yeah, no, that's better than mine. Yeah, I'll take that one.
Yeah. That's another thing about stories. You interpret it based on your own experience, as you said, and that's the beauty of it. Well, Gary, this was really fun. I had a great time.
Me too.
I hope the audience had a great time. My goal with this is always to leave people with more questions than answers when they finish to listen to this, and that thinking is a good thing, and having questioning things is that, and maybe wondering, hey, maybe you should grab a pen and start writing some. Apart from that, I want to thank you again for being here, for sharing your stories. There'll be links on the notes for getting in touch with you. You have a website, your social media, and all of that. And of course, stay tuned, everybody. Subscribe, because we'll have a lot more stories. We're all made of stories, as we said here many times. Gary, thank you so much.
Oh, it's truly my honor and a true pleasure, really.
Cool. Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.